cuttings from it and start some more plants. Now legally, you can do that. They don't want you to know you can. You can legally propagate as many roses. It'll say the tag or the box or whatever it comes in will probably say patented rose propagation prohibited. What that means is you can't sell it. But they don't want you to know is it's perfectly legal for you to take a cutting and start 50 plants of it. But don't offer them for sale. Do it to plant them in your own yard. But once you know what you're looking for, you can look down at the base and you'll see normally a stem the size of your index finger comes up, and then you'll see like it's something kind of growing out of the side of it. That's a grafted rose. That's the point. They're not really truly, most of them are budded rather than grafted. What they do is take a cutting of one of the stronger rootstock roses, root it, and let it grow for a year. So you've got this nice little plant coming up that is the rootstock rose, so to speak. What they do is take a knife and make a slit in the bark in the side. They put in a single bud. You know how when you look up and down the stem right at the base of where every set of leaves was, you'll see that little bud. They simply take one of those, they take that out, insert it in that little slit that they've made in the bark of the rootstock, tie it up, cut the top off of it, and so then it sprouts and begins to grow. That's basically how they graft, or in most cases, bud roses. Yes, sir.
Bob, do they ever graft multiple varieties of roses on one rootstock?
You'll see that occasionally, not real often. You see it more with fruit trees than you do the so-called fruit cocktail tree. But, and I don't know why, there's no reason you couldn't graft multiple roses onto one rootstock. But I don't know that I've ever really seen that on roses. Be pretty.
Yeah.
But,
Bob, excuse me.
Yes.
The butterfly rose bush.
That's always going to be on its own roots. Nobody grafts mutalis.
Okay, but are we speaking the same growing conditions for those as well? Okay.
Yeah. If there's any kind of rose that, is really different, I'll tell you what its own specific requirements are. We're going to talk about rose sizes in just a minute. When we talk about butterfly rose, we talk about big roses. But the most important thing starting out is understand the difference in grafted roses and own root roses, and wherever possible choose own root roses, because those are what are going to last the longest and probably grow best for you. Yes, sir.
In general, when they refer to antique roses, are those always own
Virtually
root?
all antique roses are own root roses. Yes, sir. Good point. At one point we only recommended antique roses because they were some of the only, quote, own root roses that you would find out there. But there are a lot of newer roses nowadays that are being grown on their own roots. But if it says antique, it's almost certainly an own root rose. If it doesn't, it may or may not be. But and there's a real good point too I want to tell you about antique roses, and that is just because it says antique does not mean that it grows well in this area. There are several different classes of roses. Most of these antique roses are quite hardy. In fact, most of them are what they call found roses. They go out to old cemeteries, old homesteads, places like that, and find roses that have been growing there without care for maybe 50 years, maybe 100 years. Those are tough, hardy roses in the area that they are growing. But what's a really tough, hardy rose on an old homestead in Kentucky may not be a real tough, hardy rose on your lousy soil here in San Antonio. And some of the classes of roses are simply more disease prone. There's one type of rose called a bourbon rose. I don't really know exactly where that name came from, but I like the name. But they are very, very susceptible to black spot in this area.
I got that.
So, okay.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about black spot and what to do about it in just a few minutes.
But otherwise, all of them, I have like 80, I think, all came through the freeze.
Yeah. Oh, the roses, this freeze wasn't enough to bother roses. Scared the heck out of a lot of people. I had a very knowledgeable engineer up in the Bernie area. He said, I guess I've lost my roses, all the leaves fell off. I said, John, you haven't lived here very long. You know that anytime we have a cold winter, perfectly normal for all the leaves to fall off your roses. But yeah, no, this winter should not have been cold enough to really do damage, really to any degree to the roses. But some of the diseases can be problematic, but we'll talk about those in just a few minutes. So, okay, we're going to have a real sunny spot. We're going to choose roses that are on their own roots rather than grafted. Beyond that, probably the most important thing is to think about the size of the bush that you want, whether you want a climber or a bush rose, and whether you want a rose that's pretty much going to bloom throughout the growing season, or one that's going to put all its glory into one big show of flowers at once. And, you know, that's not to say that, you know, it's better to have a bush or a climber. It's not necessarily to say that it's not a good rose to have if it only blooms just a single time during the year. You're about to see one of the prettiest roses out there come into bloom sometime in the next very few weeks, called the Lady Banksy rose. Rosa Banksia, lutea, and alba. There's a white form and there's a yellow form. And nice things about this rose, it has no thorns. It is the most deer resistant, not totally, but it's the most deer resistant of the roses that I've found. And when it blooms, it is spectacular. It makes a huge rose. If you look around, you know, old neighborhoods, you may see this rose 30 feet up into a tree. And you may see what looks like a tree with the top of it full of a very light yellow flower. That's just the Lady Banks that got started somehow and got its, you know, limbs growing up and wound around. They can be trimmed and, you know, put like over the top of an arbor. It's so sad. It used to be up here toward the other end of Sunset Road, up when the place that's now Madison's Hair Place was a florist shop up there, Alamo Plants and Petals. Right along the front there, they had about 5 or 6 big fan-shaped trellises, things that came up and out like this. They were about this tall. Every spring when the Lady Banks roses came into bloom, those were just like solid yellow shields all along that property line. Lady Banks is a gorgeous rose. Little flowers about this big around, but lots and lots and lots of them. But it blooms once, and that's all the flowers you're going to get until next year. That used to be true of virtually all of our climbing roses. And still, if you're going to buy a climber, you might want to ask whether it's what they call remontant is the word they use, but whether you want a once-blooming rose or an ever-blooming rose, because most of the climbers do not bloom as freely as the bush-type roses. Now there's another big difference in climbing roses and bush roses, and that is in the time that we prune them. Also to some extent in the way that we prune them, but in the time that we prune them. Because bush roses make their flowers, make their buds on the new growth that comes out. These new little bright colored shoots that you see coming up, that's a bush rose, and that's where the flowers are going to be. On a climbing rose, the buds form on the wood that grew last year. So when it comes to pruning, in the case of a bush rose, and pruning we'll talk about in a second, but it's not nearly as necessary on an own-root rose as it is on some of the grafted roses. But your bush roses, if you're going to prune them, you do it before they bloom, and then the new growth comes popping out and you have lots of flowers on it. The climbing roses that bloom on the wood that grew last year, you let them bloom before you even think about getting the pruning shears out. Because if you prune your climbers at the time you're pruning your bush roses, you just cut virtually all the buds off and you're just cheating yourself out of all the flowers that you could have enjoyed. If you have Lady Banks roses in your yard, don't even think about pruning them now, no matter how wild and straggly they look, because every limb you take off, you're just cheating yourself out of all the blooms that would have come out on that. So with the climbers, we prune after they bloom in the spring. With the bush roses, if we're going to prune, we prune before they bloom in the spring.
Oh, is that what this is right here, Banksia?
I'm sorry?
Is that a Banksia there?
Yeah, this is a Lady Banks right here. This is actually the white form of the Lady Banks rose right here.
Are they perennial, or they do grow year to year?
Oh yeah, yeah. I've got one in my yard at the ranch that I know is probably at least 75 years old. They grow for a long, long time.
So Bob, at this point, none of my roses have bloomed, they're bush roses, and I wanted to just control the size of them just because they're getting a little leggy. So even though they haven't bloomed, is now the appropriate time to do that?
Well, a month ago was the appropriate time. You can still do it now if you want to, but bush roses, if they need to be pruned to control their growth, we normally prune around Valentine's Day in the spring, and then many times we'll also prune around Labor Day in the fall. That is because when you prune, you stimulate a burst of new growth. When you get that burst of new growth, you're going to get flowers. And a grafted rose should be pruned heavily to maintain the good vigor in a grafted rose.